Thank you very much. I've been asked to say a little bit about how this came about, the MacTutor website, and that's what I hope to do now. That's the familiar picture which we've just seen in the previous presentation. It all started back in 1988. In 1988, the mathematics department got a micro laboratory of Macintosh computers, and some of us thought, well, we better think of doing something with them. And John and I started to write some software to undertake mathematical investigations. We enjoyed it greatly. We learned a lot doing it. It was great fun. And in 1994, we were in the finals of the European Academic Software Award, which was held in Heidelberg. Now, John and I had both been always interested in using history as part of our teaching, and so we had historical comments and some biographies already in our software, which was linked to various things. So when you talked about Cauchy's theorem, you could click on Cauchy and find out something about who Cauchy was. And before we went to Heidelberg, well, it was John's idea. John said, why don't we put the history on the web, which was just in 1994 just starting to become widely used. And John put it on the web, and we went to Heidelberg, and we were lucky enough to win the European Academic Software Award. We won the mathematics section, and we were told informally it was the best software of the whole of the we showed the judges there the history that we put onto the web, which they liked. We showed them all the rest of the software. But once it was on the web, then we started to get reactions to it and comments coming back and things which just encouraged us to keep developing the website. Originally, the material we had was aimed at our own undergraduates. It was aimed largely at the courses we've been teaching, and we developed it in that way. We had no idea of producing something which was covering everything. We had no idea of producing something that was going to be available to everybody to look at. So that's where it started. And we tried to make it, once we had it up on the web, we tried to make it as widely available as possible. People have always asked me who I was aiming it at, and I've said, well, I try to aim it at as wide an audience as possible. I'd like it to be interesting to 11-year-old children at school. If they can look up something, I would like it to be interesting to students at university, at professors who want to get something, information about the people that they're talking about in their lectures. That's impossible, of course, and I don't claim ever to have achieved that, but that's a sort of overriding aim. The one people that I have always said I never aimed at, and very definitely didn't aim at, were people like yourselves, historians of mathematics. So, because I'm trying to aim it at a very general audience, I try to keep down the technicalities. But then, of course, as I say, people who are giving lectures on more advanced topics and want to use it will know something about things, so you have to put in at least a little bit of information that links to things that they understand about. And so, here's an example here of Gauss's biography, for instance. We mention in Gauss's biography things like the binomial theorem, quadratic reciprocity ruler, and compass, etc. And all of those are linked, so you click on those and you get a short description of what they actually are. Now, I looked up the usage of the website in July. The number of requests, the average number of requests per day was 261,706. There were hits from 210 countries, it said. Now, actually, that's impossible, because there's only 195 countries. But, well, I know where the discrepancy comes from. The discrepancy comes from the fact that there are .com, there are .edu, which it treats as countries because it doesn't know otherwise. And there are two others that I didn't even know about. There's .museums, for instance, and things like that. But essentially it means that it's getting hits from essentially every country in the world. I was interested to even find out where some of them were. I didn't know where Palo was, and it's the one on the left, and I didn't know where Aruba was, and it's the one on the right. Huge changes, of course, in the 22 years since we first put it up on the web. Huge changes in the way that we write biographies now. When it first went up in 1994, the only material I had to use was things like the Dictionary of Scientific Biography and obituaries in journals. So we had our library, but basically things outside our library and other libraries that I visited was all that I had access to. Now, of course, the world is very different. You have access to the web, and you have access to a huge amount of material. So, initially, I couldn't put up biographies of anyone except people who already had biographical material written about them, because that's the way I was working. I'm not a historian going to do original research into anybody, and so it had to be that. Now it's rather different. Because there is so much information on the web, you can start to construct biographies of people that don't have full biographies written. And you can do things like this, which is something which I did just very recently. And if you look up all of the information that I could find about Paul Halmosh, now I knew Paul Halmosh. He was, came to St Andrews many times, and I knew him reasonably well. He wrote an autobiography. There's a lot of articles about him. They all say he was born in Budapest, his mother died when he was 6 months old, his father emigrated to the United States, Paul stayed in Budapest until 1929, then he went to join his father, etc. There's a standard information. Every biography I could find, including his autobiography, has some sort of subset of that information in it. None of them say who the father was, or who his brothers were, etc. But it's easy to find that out now. On the web, there's the 1930 US Census. So I can look it up, sitting in my office, and I get the name of his father, Sandor Halmosh. I get the date of birth of his father. I get his mother died when he was 6 months old. His mother died in 1916. She was Paula Rosenberg. I get the sons' names. I say they're born about because, annoyingly, censuses only give you the date, the age at that date, and they don't give you the date of birth. So I can find out a lot and add it to my biography of Paul Halmosh, which doesn't seem to appear in other places, and it's very easy to find. And there's a whole lot more information there about Paul Halmosh and his family, which is all in the 1930 census. The lady he remarried, she already had children, all that information is in the census. They had two servants. One was born in Germany, the other born in Czechoslovakia. Well, the other was born in Czechoslovakia, it says. Of course, she wasn't born in Czechoslovakia because there wasn't a Czechoslovakia when she was born, but there was at the time that they filled in the 1930 census. That in itself I found reasonably interesting. I mean, just the fact that somebody would say they were born in Czechoslovakia even though Czechoslovakia hadn't existed at the time. But of course, whenever you look up things, there are problems. Nothing, as you know, is ever quite as simple as all the facts sort of match each other. We know, and it's, I think, very definitely true, that Paul Hartmosh stayed in Budapest until 1929, but the census says he came to the United States in 1924. That's either a mistake, which is possible, or else he did come in 1924 and went straight back to Budapest. I doubt that, but it's possible. Slightly more puzzling even is against the two brothers. I thought, well, I'll find out when they got. I knew from Paul's own accounts that his brothers had left Budapest earlier than he had, but after the father. They joined the father at a later date. I thought I'll find out when they entered the United States. Against those, it says they entered the United States NA. And that either means not available or not applicable. I think probably not applicable. And I don't know why. It should be applicable. Anyway, as I say, there are always puzzles. Accuracy. Yeah. Accuracy is something that worries me, and always has. It worries me, I suppose, because, as I indicated before, the use of the archive is so enormous. It's being used by such a huge number of people across the whole world, and therefore, if there are whole lots of things in it that are wrong, I'm transmitting this information, and people are copying it. So, it worries me. It's difficult to know what you can do about it. All I can say is that one of the huge advantages of the web is that the material is read by a lot of people, and it's read by people who know something about it. And some of them will point out errors, sometimes misprints. I'm very good at creating misprints. My fingers seem to type things in the wrong order sometimes, so letters get transposed, but they will suggest errors, more substantial errors than that, which we can correct. Here's an example, for instance, of one that we got recently from Catherine Goldstein. She wrote us a message about Fenical de Bessy. This is actually a copy from her email. The article I wrote about Fenical de Bessy is based on what it says about him in David Sturdy's book, and it's also based on Condorcet's Eloge, which he wrote at the time that Fenical de Bessy died. But Catherine Goldstein says Condorcet got it wrong. Even though he knew him personally, he's confused him with his brother. And so the information that he gives, and much of the information he gives about Condorcet, is actually about Fenical de Bessy's brother, Nicholas de Bessy, who was a poet, and not about the mathematician. We can change it, we can put it right. Of course, there is the problem. As you all know, no two historians will agree. It's fun. I mean, I like the fact that it is something that is discussed and people have different opinions. That's good. But of course, there's David Sturdy, who is a recognized historian. There is Catherine Goldstein, who is a recognized historian, who says he has it wrong. And Condorcet, who knew Fenical de Bessy, has it wrong. And we have to make a judgment as to which of these is going to be correct. And there's the other great problem, of course. If you want to make it accessible to a wide number of people, you do have to skate over things in a way that historians on the whole don't like. And here's an example, of course, of one of the most famous cases of this, Eric Temple Bell. He wrote many popular books on the history of mathematics, and they turned an awful lot of people on to mathematics. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. But they contain many inaccuracies. Does it matter? Different people have different opinions. Alan Broadbent, for instance, writing about Bell, is very positive. His style is clear and exuberant. His opinions, whether we agree with them or not, are expressed forcibly, often with humour and a little gentle malice. And he goes on to say, really, this is good stuff. Kenneth May, somewhat less friendly to Bell. Bell's insights and provocative style continue to influence and intrigue professional mathematicians in spite of their historical inaccuracies and sometimes fanciful interpretations. And then Anne Hibner-Koblitz, even more critical, Bell might well become known to future generations of mathematicians and historians as the legend maker of the history of mathematics. It is to him that mathematicians are largely indebted for distorted impressions of their predecessors. So, do you say Bell did a good job because he turned so many people on to mathematics? Or did you say that's a disgrace because it's full of inaccuracies? There are difficulties here. There's also difficult areas of history. I mean, people criticize me because, on the whole, I try not to express opinions. I don't think the Nazis were a good thing, but I try not to put personal opinions into things too heavily, and I may be criticized by both sides for not putting in enough. And people say, you know, you should stay out of these, and they say, well, people in Germany shouldn't have got involved. But it's not as easy as that. And let me give you just one case. You see, if you lived in Germany in the 1930s, 1940s, there were laws which said that you had to favour the Nazis. There were laws which said you had to discriminate against the Jews. You either broke the law or you did those things. It's a difficult decision. Here's somebody who did try to stay out of it. Arnold Schultz. He wrote an outstanding thesis on the inverse problem of Galois theory. He got his doctorate in 1929. He was appointed to Freiburg as assistant to Alfred Louis. And then, after a bit, in 1931, he changed to become Gustav Deutsch's assistant. Now, Alfred Louis was Jewish, and he was dismissed in 1933. Deutsch was, if I say a Nazi, he certainly believed in the Nazi principles. He declared that things like algebra and number theory were not proper mathematics, they were Jewish things, and so he eliminated them from the syllabus. And Schultz was in some degree of difficulty. He was an algebraist, and suddenly he didn't have anything to teach. His subject had been removed. He resigned. He tried to get another appointment. People said, you should go to the United States. He said, I'm a German. I don't want to leave Germany. He tried to get another job. His referees made comments like this. Politically, Schultz is not reliable. At Freiburg, he was permanently together with Jews and former communists. Schultz will not understand Nazism. Unsurprisingly, with a reference like that, nobody would give him a job. In fact, he didn't live long. He was conscripted into the army, and he died in 1942 of pulmonary tuberculosis. But he was a man who tried to stay out of all of the trouble, and you just can't. So, these are some of the problems. We get a lot of problems, criticism, I suppose, which comes from people who get very upset about nationalities. And we have maps, basically present-day maps, but they put various people in countries that they didn't consider they should be in, to be born in. If you look at Romania and Hungary, for instance, there are all sorts of problems. Hungarians were born in towns which were Hungary, but are now Romania. These things change. People get very hot under the collar. You can't please people. If you put one thing, half the world objects. If you put the other half of the world objects. So these things are very difficult to satisfy everybody, but we do our best. So I'd like to leave it there and open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
I'd like to suggest we take a few quick questions for Edmund's talk before we then move on to a more general discussion. So does anyone...
How are decisions made about adding new entries, and who does that?
Decisions are made in a very sort of ad hoc fashion. Some are added because they're suggested by people. Quite a number of people write to us and say, you haven't got a biography of so-and-so, yes, if I can find out enough information to write a biography, then I will often add it. So I often add biographies of people. If you write a biography of X, you'll find he was taught by Y and Z. I don't have biographies of Y and Z. I may add them. It's not a scientific process. It's just sort of building it up.
Two questions relating to your account of Paul Halmos and his family, family, which actually rang bells with the work I'm going to speak about of Carl Pearson. Two issues that have arisen in Carl Pearson. Firstly is, so we've got his family, and I've actually gone further into his extended family, and the question is always there in my mind, well, so what? What has that got to do with, as it were, the biography of Carl Pearson or mathematics or anything? And the other is the significance of the gaps. Certainly with Carl Pearson, there seem to be deliberate gaps, and you referred to consistent gaps. And I wonder whether the fact that this information was not in even what Paul wrote itself has some significance.
The fact that the information isn't in what Paul wrote is very definitely significant in that it says something about Paul. There's no doubt about that. I mean, his autobiography is very much a mathematical autobiography.
Yes,
he is interested in the mathematicians he met, in the discussions he had with mathematicians. He plays down everything outside that. So to that extent, yes, the omissions by Paul are quite deliberate when it comes to family and things like that. When it comes to myself, then yes, I am interested in people's families. I'm interested in why they became mathematicians, if they have brothers and sisters that became mathematicians, engineers, or whatever. Yes, I think that says something to the family home they lived in, and says something to their backgrounds, and that does interest me.
Right.
So saw some question here first and then Kenneth.
Just a very quick question. MacTutor is used often by historians to give life dates. And one of the problems there, particularly with 17th century, is the new style, old style. And I wonder what your policy is there. How much time do you invest in actually finding out the accurate dates? Because as I said, people do tend to go first to MacTutor these days to get those.
I mean, the attempt is to give people dates by the present calendar, if you see what I mean. So, Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day, but not Christmas Day according to his date of birth that's given in MacTutor. I mean, it's an impossible one to get over. We could write a paragraph explaining these things for everyone that it concerns, but again, there are difficulties in that. Our policy, I think, John probably is more involved in that than I am, but I think our policy is basically to use the present day calendar, even though it didn't exist in Newton's time. Because the calendars in the rest of Europe are different from the calendars here. The calendars in Scotland were different from the calendars in England. They started on different days. There's all sorts of differences in calendars. So yes, it is a huge problem.
Could I just suggest off the top of my head that one of the reasons for them not applicable in the 1930 census might have been there was a footnote saying no need to enter this information if it was entered in the previous 1920 census.
It wouldn't have been in the 1920 census because none of them were there in 1920.
But you suggested that they entered rather early. Okay.
Father entered in 1924, and they definitely didn't enter the United States before none of them entered the United States before 1924.
Okay.
Okay, one more there and then there, and then perhaps we'll move on to the discussion. So,
I'm just interested in the sort of logistics of your day-to-day lives, if you like. I mean, when did you decide that? I mean, when did this become your day job?
When I retired.
I think we'll come back to that.
It was a hobby before that.
Yeah.
No more than a hobby for both John and I before that. We never got any sort of recognition for this within our duties in the department.
It was one of our duties as lecturer.
No. It was a hobby until we retired. Now it's sort of our lives.
Okay, there was a question here.
Yeah, it might actually go to the second part, because you mentioned this thing where Sturvey and Captain Goldstein didn't agree on something. And I was wondering why not put both opinions in there. I mean, of course, there is one truth. It could either be like his brother had this position or him. But the fact is that in history, very, very often we cannot find out what actually is the truth. And I have a little bit of a problem when you present something as a truth to somebody. And I think it's much more sensible to show people, well, we have no clue. We have two very notable scholars who have very good theories, both of them. And one of them might be true, neither of them might be, you know. But why don't you do that? Why don't you put in both opinions? Do you think it gets extensive, or?
I mean, I sometimes do. It depends on what it is. I think in this particular case, I think Sturdy is wrong. Because he's, we know what he's copying. We know he's copying Condorcet. Condorcet is available to us now. But the arguments that Captain Goldstein gives, I think, are very convincing, and they convince me that she's right. So I wouldn't, in that case, present both arguments. There are other cases where I may present both arguments, but there is a difficulty. I'm not writing for historians. If you do too much of that, you get something which is technically interesting to historians, but not interesting in general to the public. So, I mean, I try to get a balance between that, but any balance you try and get, you always get wrong. You can only try your best.
If there's no more urgent questions, I suggest we thank Edmund once more. And I think we've got roughly 25 minutes left for some discussion. Now, before I start that, let me quickly say who I am, and why on earth I'm standing up here. My name is Edmund Robertson, and I'm part of the maths department as well, but I'm an applied mathematician. And haven't really been involved in the history side all that much, apart from using it like most of us use it in the department. If I'm teaching something, I'll have a quick look and see if there's just a little bit of context I can give our students. I'm also the director of research for the department since a couple of years. And I think that's where I started to take more note of the website, because the university has sat up and taken note of the website. Because quite frankly, they can only dream of having 200,000 hits on the university's website. So obviously, this is a brand for the university, and the management have their own idea as to what should happen, how it should be developed. But I've always realized that John and Edmund and the school have their own idea as well. And John and Edmund have been very modest, saying this isn't, or they haven't, I'm going to say this wasn't their day job, it's going to become their day job when they retired. But with the development of the website, even before John and Edmund retired, the school has a very popular undergraduate module on history of maths. And as John and Edmund retired, the school faced a bit of a problem. What were we going to do? Were we going to keep that culture in the department alive of having a component of history of maths available for undergraduates? And that, for me, that discussion is certainly linked to some extent with the website as well. So Isabel has asked me to chair this session for the next half an hour as to what people think should happen, how it should develop, the MacTutor website. She asked me to emphasize we're not making any promises here, but I think it would be very useful for us to get views, and we realize they will perhaps be conflicting views. We'll take them, we'll make some notes and take them forward. So, how do people think the website should develop? What do they like about it? What would they hate to lose? And why or what is valuable about the website? So, Isabel, do you want to add anything before we start, or shall I just open?
Just to say that we want to know things you would like, and as Nika said also, the things you would hate to lose. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to keep what's good and think about, and the whole emphasis is on making this sustainable and doing what is valuable to the mathematical community, to further John and Edmund's vision for it, and to take it forward.
So, over to all of you. I think you were just first, and then we come to Luke.
I have a particular interest because I did a data set a long time ago, I can't even remember when it was, in some research, which I'm going to talk about later on today. My name is Davis. The thing was that this data set was just there, and I asked MacTutor if they would like to have it for their website. They very kindly said yes, and they very kindly called it the data set, and it's a data set of women mathematicians. Now, what I didn't say was, I don't know from what Robertson said how separate it is. I mean, it's hard, but I don't know how many components the website has and how many they are thinking of that kind. So that's one question. The second question is a question of integration of the women mathematicians into the community of mathematicians as a whole. This particular data set is historical to the extent that it's to do with women learning mathematics before they were allowed to learn mathematics at universities. We see this graduates at British universities from 1878 to 1940. And it finishes at 1940 on the grounds that I said on the preamble page to this thing that it was stopped at 1940 because that's a good beginning of the Second World War, and figures then got distorted. So what I do not believe, at least my feeling is that I do not believe that women mathematicians should be treated separately from mathematicians in any more. And I would like to see a finish date, needn't be the one I've chosen, but a finish date for separation of women and men. Now, I'm told that MacTutor has an index of all mathematicians.
That's what I thought, yeah.
It also has an index of women mathematicians separately. And not mine, but a different one, of all mathematicians up to you. Now, you know what
In the MacTutor base,
No.
but what
to achieve something. John, do you want to go? Yeah.
There is an overall list of biographies which contains all the people in our archive.
Man and women.
And
Any gender.
And then those in the archive who are female have a separate but additional index, so that those people who want to actually trace female mathematicians in our archive can do so easily. And I think that's quite a sensible thing, because there are people who want to examine that particular cohort. And just as we have a list of mathematicians who were born in Scotland and mathematicians who were born in Ireland, and all things like that, it seems reasonable that we should have a list of mathematicians who are female, and that's what that particular part is. It's not a list of all female mathematicians. It's a list of female mathematicians who are in our archive. And it's not just modern mathematicians, it's a set of all mathematicians.
So there is no end date.
Yeah,
You would
that's right,
continue
yeah.
to do that.
All the way back to MacTutor and people in the...
So for the purpose of diversity, perhaps there should be a complementary list of male mathematicians.
I would be only too happy to put up such a thing. I don't think it's particularly useful.
this is...
Do people feel like they need to use a microphone?
Do you need it for the recording?
Do you need
Is
it
that
for
It
the
might be
recording?
helpful, but if it's a hassle, it's fine.
No, we can do it if it needs to be.
People happy.
Is it hard for you to record it otherwise?
It might just give a slightly better audio.
Shall we try? We'll
We can
do
try.
our best.
I can run around.
Okay, we'll have a comment here, and then we were going to the lady with the red top, and I saw another hand there. Yep.
This is only picking me up halfway through. I only wanted to say that if you're going to have different lists, that's fine. But the thing is that you shouldn't have lists that sound discriminatory. Say non-white mathematicians or something of this kind, which is a factor of, we're getting back to physical appearance, which was discussed yesterday.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that just now. We might come back to this.
Well, I would like everybody's opinion.
Isabel is taking notes. I don't know if we want to. Is your comment going on those lines?
No, it's completely different. So we might
Do you want to continue?
No,
Mine's purely about the presentation and the appearance and what they call the user experience.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that it is absolutely flat. So many websites have a makeover and suddenly there are pictures that change and have flashy things. And personally I find that just very, very distracting. So I like the fact that you've just got text and there's illustrations when you want them and it's very obvious where to go to click if you want more information.
Yeah, that really dates back because the website is so old.
Well, yeah, but I would like to keep it that way. I wouldn't use it as much if you introduced changing pictures and flashing things.
The original version of browser didn't allow you to do things like having more than one window or things like that.
Well,
and so there's a lot of that still in our website.
Yes, and
I also quite like the simple work.
It's simple and it's clear where to go next, and if you want the footnotes, then the footnotes are easy to find, and then you can go back to where you were. And so please don't fancy it up.
Does that also mean it loads quickly?
Yes.
Does that also then mean it loads quickly? Because
yes, I mean it was originally designed in that way because back when people only had very sort of elementary connections to the World Wide Web, it was necessary to actually arrange things so that it didn't have much bandwidth.
Okay, I saw a question over here. You've been waiting. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So mortality is a big issue in the fact that we're all going to die. Sorry to bring such a difficult and awkward topic up. But so in the physics community, there's an Alliance for Archive, which is an oral history archive. So and any Thomas, Richard, or Harriet can go and perform oral history, or perform such a thing in someone else, and send the MP3 file to the archive, and they will, you can deposit it. Have you ever thought of starting something like that catch the living mathematicians before they pop their clogs, as it were? And a second question, which is quite rude, but you said quotes the university in a sort of dark Shakespearean way, have their own views on what should happen to the MacTutor site, and I'm just curious what the university thinks.
I wasn't implying an awful lot by that. I think they're certainly very keen that it keeps the St Andrews brand, given the number of hits and the fact that it's for the university. So they're certainly keen. Sorry?
It earns money. It's a red impact case study.
I didn't want to go too dark, sorry. Let's leave it at that. I think they're certainly keen that it keeps the St Andrews brand.
I mean, in terms of mortality, one of the things that we worried about maybe 10 years ago when it seemed like a bit of a joke was that Edmund and I are getting older and older. I think the university is slightly concerned that when either Edmund or I become incapable for one reason or another of continuing to work with the website, that they should find some way of continuing it inside St Andrews. And that's actually quite difficult because of the pig-headed way that we went about it. I mean, we treated it as a sort of a hobby, and we've done things our own way, and it would actually be quite difficult to get other people to carry on in that sort of vein, and in particular the technology that we use would be quite difficult to adapt to other forms of technology. So that is something that the university is examining, and I do hope that the university will find some sort of solution in the next sort of 20 years or however long we can keep going, to actually continue it in much the same way as it is at the moment.
So that is one of the things we're looking at, how to migrate it to a different platform, but which keeps part of what you refer to, kind of the idea and the spirit in which John and Edmund wanted the website to continue.
It's the maintenance and keeping updated as well as the platform, of course, which Edmund has been doing so admirably and continues to do.
What do we value about the MacTutor website?
To a certain extent, John has just anticipated what I was going to say, because I think it's not so much the development now, but I'd like to sort of jump 20 years ahead and so. And I was a bit disappointed. I thought that Edmund, who is sort of a foresightful person, would certainly have considered this long-term vision, and he would have given us some of his ideas, although maybe he wanted to give us a clean slate. I find these sorts of discussions are very often nicely formulated in terms of what the tensions are, and one of them is between it looks a bit clunky, should it be modernised, whatever that means, and so on, and we all have our views on that. And there's also what I think is probably a crucial tension, which is to do with the branding, because from the point of view of St Andrews, I can understand why people would want to keep it here, but would that actually be the best website in terms of the users who are worldwide? And I suspect the answer to that might be no, but there's certainly that tension there, and surely there are people in the mathematical community here and elsewhere who would give their right hand for something like that. And would that lead to the improvement? So there's the tension between, as it were, the localness and the homegrownness and the long-term expansion. There may be a tension there.
I think that's a very natural tension. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, so especially yesterday we heard a couple of talks about crowdsourcing and this kind of thing. So I wonder if you could maybe in relation to that point comment on if you would see that as any viable ways of, you know, obviously as the number of biographies you have increase at some point, you know, even if you have people that you can pass it on to, eventually you'd imagine you might need a group of people.
Oh, we've always welcomed anyone to donate biographies to us, and we do have a number of them. It's not a large number, given, I mean, there's about 3,000 biographies in total. I never counted how many have been donated by other people, but it's a small percentage of that. But we certainly welcome it. When people write and ask us to add various people to the list, I always reply by saying, would you like to write the biography yourself? And they always say no. Well, not all of them. But yes, I mean, that is one of the... But, I mean, early on in Wikipedia's life, they wanted to take our archive and put it wholesale into Wikipedia, which of course gets exactly what you want. I mean, you get anyone contributing to anything, and I certainly didn't want that. I told Wikipedia I was very happy if they linked any of to it anywhere they wanted, but I wanted to keep control of it. I didn't want everybody to be able to, and I have seen. I think Wikipedia now has a much better control than it did when it started off. When it started off, there were some really ridiculous things in it. And there were some things which, about some of my colleagues in it, which were absolutely disgraceful, which we removed. But I mean, when people have the ability to do that, and anyone has the ability to do things.
Do you think there's a threat from Wikipedia in that they're putting out more and more articles, and so some of them have been fairly blatantly taken from MacTutor, but do you think in the long term, if people want to look up a mathematician, they will go to Wikipedia rather than MacTutor, or first be linked to
I think when a lot
Wikipedia?
of people look for a particular mathematician, they probably will go to Wikipedia. But very often you find that if you look for the other references of people who want to go deeper into that, you'll find that MacTutor is one of the things down at the bottom of Wikipedia.
Yes.
There's the other sites that, well, sometimes the information has been copied from, but I mean, sometimes in Wikipedia there is extra information as well, so we're quite happy that people go through that route.
There's some very, very good material in Wikipedia, but many of the people that we have biographies and pretty extensive biographies of have a 2-sentence biography in Wikipedia, and a little note, this is a stub, and they hope somebody send it.
And there was a book.
Yes, and it was to add to that about the tension. A lot of people, MacTutor users, have told me that one of the things they really appreciate about it is knowing that it has been through Edmund's and John's sort of editorial control. They can trust it. I think it's a huge issue of trust in the data here. Whereas Wikipedia, and as you say, Wikipedia has improved enormously, and it's been very interesting to see actually that their original, very sort of wide embracing crowdsourcing model, they have gradually refined a huge amount of editorial control there now, because they sort of realise it can work. So that from the point of view, I get the impression that I'd like to get that verified or shot down in flames by the other people here, is this issue of trust and how important or otherwise it is that you can say MacTutor has had a degree of academic verification the users can sort of trust or point out.
I think to add to that, and perhaps Don and Edmund, is there a difference for you, Isabel, that it's been gone through the editorial control of 2 mathematicians rather than historians? And I think that maybe comes back to your comment as well. Is there a difference there for you?
Probably not, because, well, but probably not, because I think, you know, what they're trying to make sure is accurate is, if you like, a lot of the factual stuff. And to some extent, anything that matters, whether a historian or a mathematician, as we all know, historical interpretation. When you get onto interpretation,
that's maybe where the difference.
Well, that's where the difference starts to come in.
Okay, I've got a hand there.
I think it does make a difference though, because it's hosted by a university and it's academics who run it. So if you submitted an essay as an undergrad and you had Wikipedia in your reference list, the marker wouldn't be best pleased, whereas if you reference MacTutor, because it's hosted by a university, it has sort of better understanding. So and that's where I think the keeping it in the university might have some benefit to MacTutor, because it adds validity, credibility to it.
So people who mark essays, would you agree with that? Yeah? So the fact that it's an academic-based resource. Any other
there was one time I remember hearing somebody saying that in an essay, if they needed to steal something, they all steal it from the Encyclopedia Britannica, because they knew that their college tutors would never actually trace that, because of course they could never read encyclopedia. Sort of low reference rather than a high one. Very Wikipedian.
Talking of stealing, I talked yesterday about the Jesuit website. Expressed worries about legal implications. Is there any protection over what is written in MacTutor against plagiarism by other people? Or indeed vice versa, in cases like images which may have been taken?
No, I mean, there's nothing much we can do. I mean, it's on the World Wide Web, it's available to everybody. And if somebody wants to steal it, then there's very little we can do to stop them. On the other hand, we did have some cases a year ago of some Chinese man who had taken quite a lot of our biographies, and he'd written them up under his own name, and he'd apparently actually got promotion to his own university as a result of doing this. And so we complained to the university authorities, and eventually they took it down, but not straight away. So I mean, there is a certain amount of passing on. I mean, once or twice, for example, we've actually had misprints in MacTutor. And if you then go to Google and you Google that particular misprint, then you find rather to your surprise this occurs all over the world in different contexts, which means it's actually been taken from MacTutor.
On the whole, I don't mind if people steal it as long as they leave our names on it. I take objection when people steal it and put their own names on it.
I think you had a comment still.
Yeah, I can speak up if you want to. And the thing is, exactly this thing that it is hosted by a university and hosted by academia is the reason why I completely understood what you said beforehand, but this is why I'm sort of critical of this image of presenting factual history. That's what it was like, because it starts to become something like, as a fact. So something like, as an addition, I could very well see you have this new feature, like not very new, but you can see some sources if you click on certain buttons, and there pops up this little window where you can see the original source. How about having like a new symbol, and if you want to, you can click on it and you can see a different opinion by it. Not in this case, as you mentioned, but in some cases we have good arguments for more than one case. So you could have your article that is appealing to everybody, but for those who want more, they can click on this additional link and find the opinion of different scholars. Something like, yeah. Yeah, it's
an interesting idea, but I mean, I wouldn't like to comment.
I mean, somebody has to write all of these sort of alternatives, make them available in some pop-up window or something. But I mean, if Edmund wants to write a whole lot of different alternatives to particular paragraphs, then I will devise some way of making those paragraphs pop up appropriately. But I doubt if he's going to bother.
The references with the alternatives are there.
Okay.
Someone reading
lady here, and then yourself, and then perhaps we'll round off, because it might be time for some caffeine. Please.
I just wanted to support the last comment, actually. I do think it's interesting if there are different points of view, and you can't always maybe decide. You can come up with one you think is best, but I do think that it's a very good idea to give even members of the public, non-historians, an idea that, you know, we're only as good as our sources.
I have also a comment about the references. You mainly, I appreciate your work very much. However, for historian, one thing is that you refer mainly to literature, to what was published, and that makes the feeling that history is done just from literature. And it would be very nice to have references to original archival sources, for example, where the nachlass or where the papers of the mathematicians are stored, etc.
There are many references to people's complete works, but again, I'm probably not systematic in that.
Yeah.
They may not do it in every case, and often, of course, they're many years after the person's died.
And I would be happy to help with MacTutor, and I think it would be perfect to have some collaborators with local knowledge across the world. Because, for example, I'm from Central Europe, from Czechia, and it's not far from here, and still there are some local things to which I'm much more sensible than perhaps you. For example, I appreciate that if somebody was born in Prague, in times when it was part of Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, you write, okay, it was Prague, former Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, now Czech Republic. But there are some cases where, well, this is not made systematically. For example, by Ludwig Berwald, it's written that he died in Lodz in Poland. But at that time, it was part of the German Reich, and you are very close to dangerous claims.
I know exactly what these problems are, because I mean, my own father was Polish. He was born in Poland, but he wasn't. I mean, there was no Poland when my father was born. So I mean, but he would have been appalled if you'd said there was no Poland. You can't be Polish. So I mean,
one of the things I've tried to do is go through and with some difficulty, actually find out what a particular territory was at the time that, say, a mathematician was born or died. It's particularly difficult, for example, in terms of early Italian mathematicians, because Italy didn't exist until the middle of the 19th century. And all the various different states and towns and cities in Italy all had a very complicated history. So in each individual case, you have to go all the way back and try and find out at that particular date exactly what that particular place was called, and then put that and then say now in wherever it is in Italy. And I mean, it's not just Italy, it's Schleswig-Holstein, it's Germany, almost anywhere in Europe with a complicated history over the last 300 years, and leads to these sort of problems. And I try and sort them out as much as I can. And it's my intention to actually, if somebody dies in or is born in a particular place, to actually give what that place was at the time that they were born or died, and then put the modern equivalent afterwards. But I'm not always completely thorough in that. I'll try and do better.
Final comment?
I was just wondering if you could even implement things where you could say like modern day Turkey, or like have some sort of systematic thing where you're kind of specifying, like, you know, I don't know, with today's calendar, this day, or modern day Turkey, or...
I mean, the difficulty is that all of our list of countries where people were born are modern day countries. So that means that, for example, everybody knows that Archimedes was a Greek, but he wasn't. He was an Italian according to modern day countries. David Hilbert was a Russian. Because, of course, although everybody knows David Hilbert was German, he was born in Königsberg, and Königsberg is now Kaliningrad, and Kaliningrad is part of Russia. Now, that's very something. I mean, I don't see how he would do. But all I can do is I can say that he was born in Königsberg and brackets now Kaliningrad, Russia. But when it comes to actually listing him along with mathematicians from a particular country, I feel I really do have to actually be consistent and put him in there. The only thing I confess that I have actually cheated on is Ireland. But for various sort of personal reasons, I've adopted the rugby definition of Ireland. I put Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland in as Ireland, and I've put all of the Irish mathematicians in like that. I know that was a bit naughty, but as I say,
you have a footnote somewhere.
You have to describe Hamilton as an Irish mathematician, not a British mathematician.
Yeah. But he's not. There's not a separate list of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland mathematicians. Whereas all other countries actually, I've taken the rugby definition.
But one of the problems, one of the problems, and I think you put your finger on what the problems are. Consistency is a huge problem because we've written these articles over 22 years, and keep changing. It is difficult. If we make a decision tomorrow to do something, there's 3,000 biographies there that we have to go back and alter, that we have to put some sort of change policy to. It is very difficult.
I haven't yet moved Crimea into Russia.
Let's wait a little. Okay, I think coffee is waiting for us. I don't know if anyone wants to make a final comment. So Edmund, John, Isabel, anyone wants to make a final?
I'm just happy that we're able to carry on doing it. And as I say, for us it's something that we enjoy doing, and I'm just glad that other people are finding it useful.
We certainly do.
Just thank them very much.
Thank you.